Welcome to Talk Law Radio with attorney Todd Marquardt of the Marquardt Law Firm at marquardtlawfirm.com.
Welcome back to Talk Law Radio. I'm Todd Marquardt here with Honorable Judge Rangel with the District Court here in Bexar County. And we've been talking about the criminal justice system. And this is the fourth segment, so you know what that means.
And now, it's time for the Talk Law Radio Legacy Spotlight. What's your legacy? Sponsored by Marquardt Law Firm.
So, Judge, in the Bible talks about legacy. In Genesis 49:1, Jacob blessed his sons and kind of told them what he expected of how they were to proceed with their lives without him. And because Marquardt Law Firm sponsors the show and we do estate planning, the central philosophy behind it is leaving a legacy to those you leave behind. And so one definition of legacy comes from the Latin verb legere, to appoint by last will. But now we use wills. Sometimes we leave assets. Sometimes besides money or property, we leave behind a legacy of service. Is there something unique you can point to that you inherited or that you learned from those who went before you? Or is there something that you hope that those that come after you will have learned from you?
That's a very good question. So I'm going to get a little personal because we're talking about that issue. So my wife passed it's going to be 5 years now, almost 5 years ago. So my daughters have been through a lot, and so I've given them basically everything that she owned that was important to her, things like pieces of jewelry, clothing, things like that, and that they really value that. And then on the same token, my father is invalid. He's 81 years old, and so requires round-the-clock care. So my brothers and I are really focused on making sure that he's taken care of and that he's okay. We sort of alternate going to see him and take care of him. I took my mom to a movie. You brought up Jacob on Easter, and I took her to go see his only son, which is a story of Abraham and Isaac. And obviously after Isaac, you get Jacob. Mm-hmm. And so it's touching. It's a beautiful story. It means a lot. And so for me, the legacy that I would really hope that my children, and they're great kids, and so they're 20s and 30s, so they're at that stage where they're exhibiting certain things. But the idea of that touch of humanity, the love for others, make sure that they service is important. My family and I have donated 300 pairs of shoes to children in need, parts of the community where there's not a lot of support every year, and just to see these children really means a lot. Martin Luther King had a lot to do with my thought process and development as it relates to caring for those that are less fortunate. We have a society where if you look at the criminal justice system, if you look at those that get arrested, and if you look at those that are victimized, both, they fall under a demographic which always includes folks, generally speaking, that are uneducated, that don't have the ability to support others because they are unsupported. They're young, no high school education. Generally speaking, they come from parts of the community that don't have a lot of support. And so it's important to get out there to meet people and to make sure that those that don't have that support, that understanding of humanity and concern for one another, that they get out there and they get involved and that they express that. They express that through not only action, but by being kind to others. It's important to be kind, and not everybody in this world is that way. We have to understand that as part of what we do, and so we just have to guard ourselves from that. Make sure that we focus on the kinds of things that make us better people. Just constantly improve who you are. In terms of things, I do have things. but I don't know if they would appreciate things like a motorcycle or I don't know if they would appreciate the clothing. But the things that I've given them that were their mothers, they really do hold an attachment to that that's meaningful. It's the memories that really matters, right?
Right.
Everybody that we carry in our heart that we care for. That's a significant thing for them to always focus on.
That's what I've learned in doing probate is even if it's not worth a lot of money, people will still fight over the things because that's all they have left. Their loved one's gone.
And I'm sure you know, attorneys, generally speaking, I know a lot that don't have wills, that don't have a probate plan, right? Like that mechanic whose vehicle seems like is always falling apart, or the contractor whose house is falling apart. There's some studies that indicate around the world that folks that are elderly, folks that are of a certain age, look back and wish that they could change, or things that they cherish. Everything revolves around relationships, everything. In the end, that's what we have. It's not only our relationships here, but our relationships with those that have passed. And so that's significant. And I think understanding that is more than just expressing it. It's actually getting a true recognition of what that means. And hopefully my kids are learning that now, and they'll always take that with them. And that's the legacy that should be passed on.
And they'll have this podcast to listen to.
Always.
And remember.
Absolutely.
You mentioned your father and the care that he needs. That's my passion, is helping the elderly understand complex legal matters and helping those that care for them with the legal issues that are involved. And when I was thinking about our show today, I thought about the felonies with exploitation of the elderly. Have you heard any of those cases?
Absolutely. So the majority of cases in felony courts, this is nationwide statistically, over 90% of those are nonviolent. And when you talk about nonviolent, you do include cases like theft. And so we have to look at those put those in a different grouping as it relates to the charges. I mean, taking advantage of elderly folks is, I've had cases where a vacuum cleaner salesman will go into a home and take advantage of the circumstance with an elderly person and take jewelry. You've had other circumstances where people are responsible for bank accounts, make themselves somehow or another a power of attorney, and they'll empty that. Others have done it by show of affection. That's a very common thing now. The romance scams happens a lot to folks that are in their 70s, where they'll be contacted by somebody and they'll be told that they're loved, and then their bank accounts will be emptied out.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that kind of where we have to, officers come in, there's warrants that they want me to look at, show that there's probable cause to freeze a bank account. $50,000, $100,000 can go in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
With somebody who can say, hey, this is what I need in order to be able to move down and be with you, kind of thing.
Yeah, so what I tell people is find somebody you trust, who's trustworthy, who's worthy of trust, because it's not always the oldest son or the daughter. Sometimes you have to look to extended family because you want to pick somebody who takes care of their own business, because they're going to be having to take care of their own business plus your business and juggle those things simultaneously, and is a person of good character. So again, it goes back to relationships, and I think it's a difficult decision, one that you shouldn't just name a child because they're your child, or you could name a bank. Right. I sometimes tell people I'd rather the bank steal from me than my own kids.
Yeah, and you make a good point. It's not only a good person, but somebody who's responsible. Because we've seen in the justice system what happens a lot is somebody has some financial issues. They mean right, they mean well, but they'll say, wait, let me borrow a little bit here. This is an opportunity that I can, and I'm going to pay this back. And then the next thing they know, they're consistently doing that to where then there's a theft of a large sum of money.
Yeah.
So somebody who's not as responsible, that's also a big thing.
Okay, well, that's a good point. Let's circle back to some of the cases that you work on. We mentioned family violence, and there's some felony DWIs, there's some felony theft. You mentioned some aggravated crimes. What portion of your day or your caseload do you think, what would be the most and what would be the least?
Probably the most cases that we see, the most types of cases that we see are drug possessions. The legislature makes certain drugs, things like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, certain pills, certain drugs, automatically they become a state jail, which is a felony offense. The more they possess, the higher that level is. And so that's probably the most. You're dealing with a lot of people that have been in the throes of addiction for a very long time. And sometimes the addiction is coupled with other violent behavior. So it's not always that you see just drug addiction or drug use. Sometimes it's that plus something else. The idea of the celebrated case, the stuff that we see on TV, those aren't as frequent.
Thank God.
Thank God, yes. We did have a death penalty case where a jury found an individual guilty and sentenced him to death. That case is currently going through the appellate process. That was about a year and a half ago. Before that, I have had a couple of other death penalty cases. There was one where a jury found a person guilty of capital murder but did not assess death. And so those are not quite as frequent. The murder rate is going up, but it's still not as frequent as those other lower level type cases. And they're very difficult to deal with because ultimately the idea is if the jury were to hear all of these facts, every single thing that would come before them from both sides, because everything is something that they should hear, what would the end result be? And in some cases, you could have a murder case where the end result's going to be life. In other cases, you could have a murder case where a jury is going to give a very minimal, when I say minimal, I'm talking 15, 20 years in prison, depending on the circumstance. And by way of example, you could have 3 people involved in a crime. Let's say 3 people go to a bank. One person pulls out a gun, shoots and kills the bank teller. That's a capital murder. All 3 could be charged with capital murder under the law of parties in Texas. But the other 2 could make the argument of, I didn't know this person was going to get shot and killed. And then so what should the punishment be there? They're still looking at capital murder where the only punishment is either death or life in prison without parole. So then if you get a plea bargain, then sometimes folks don't understand why and the how of things happen.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed being here.
This has been a lot of fun. So go to, what's your website?
BeyondTheGavelPodcast.com.
Yeah, and you can learn more about the criminal justice system with Judge Ron Rangel. And that's it for today, so I'll talk to you later.
This has been Talk Law Radio with attorney Todd Marquardt, brought to you by the Marquardt Law Firm. You can learn more at marquardtlawfirm.com. And be sure to listen to the full Talk Law Radio show Saturday mornings at 11 on 9:30 a.m. The Answer.
Each week, attorney Todd Marquardt talks about the law. His mission with the Talk Law Radio show and podcast is to help you discover your legal issue blind spots. In the beginning, God had one law. Don't eat from the fruit of that tree. Then came the 10 Commandments. Now we have federal, state, and municipal lawmakers that won't stop creating new laws. Laws that might impact you without you knowing it. Listen to the show and drop a line on Facebook or email host@talklawradio.com and let the host know what you think of the show, the topics you want to hear, and whether you want to be a guest.